Hi everyone, it's Rachel back to the Shades of Orange, and today we are talking about horror and thriller books. Happy spooky season everyone! I want to share with you what I've been reading this past month, and I have some great books to talk about, some that are not so great, and one book particular that I think would be a fantastic book to read over Halloween. So if you're interested, let's get started. First, let's talk about Leech by Hiron, and this is a book that I received for review from Tor Books. This is a piece of gothic horror and gothic science fiction that follows a doctor who is going off to this isolated chateau. He's going there to replace the previous doctor who has died and was, well, possibly murdered. And so he's going there, and you find out within the chateau they're doing some sorts of experiments, and of course the story goes from there. I thought this book was going to be almost a retelling of Frankenstein, but it definitely is its own story. It's quite unique, and I really ended up enjoying this one a lot more than I necessarily thought I would. If you're familiar with my taste, I don't necessarily love gothic fiction just because it tends to be very slow paced, very character driven, which isn't always my thing. And while I would say that this one is slower paced, it also has a good sense of suspense that kept someone like myself who needs enough narrative drive to keep going. And I thought the sense of atmosphere was so well done. The prose is really nice. And for me, the real hook was the fact that there is a very slight speculative or science fiction element to this book. And if you know me, you know that I love when that comes into a story. I thought it was well done. I wish it had been a little bit more subtle because it was a little bit more in your face once it gets exposed what is going on. I just wish it had been toned down a bit, but I still really like this one. It does have some really grotesque moments involving body horror, so be warned for that. But I did really enjoy this one, and again, I think if you love gothic horror and are looking for something that's perhaps a little bit unique, a little bit fresh, you'll really enjoy this one, especially if you're open to a story with some light speculative elements. Next up, we have Necroscope by Lumley, which is the first book in this series. This is a re-release out by Tor Nightfire, which is where I received my copy. And this is a story of a man named Harry who has some ability to communicate with the dead. And through this, he ends up getting recruited by this super secret British spy agency, and the story goes from there. And you should be aware that this is also a vampire story. And that is not something that I'm normally drawn to. I tend to steer away from vampire stories. One, because a lot of them tend to be very sparkly and romanticized. And even when they're monsters, I just find the books to be a little bit blasé, but I was very excited to check out this one because it sounded oh so different, and I will admit it was definitely different than any vampire book I've read before. Unfortunately, it was also not entirely to my taste, and that I think is the fact that it really read like a classic macho, masculine spy thriller, which just isn't something I normally read. I don't mean to stereotype or gender a book. I just personally tend to steer clear of those really classic, iconic kind of spy thrillers that get shoved into the book section of every airport. So this one was just, yeah, not entirely to my taste, but was it dark? Was it different? I think it has a lot of appeal. I mean, it's a re-release, so I do know how beloved the original book is, but it just wasn't what I expected despite that synopsis, and I was kind of let down. So not a series I plan on continuing, but hopefully other readers will check out this book for the first time and fall in love with the series that I know so many of you love. So I wish I liked it more, but I didn't. Next, I want to talk about Lute by Jennifer Thorne. This is another book that I received for review from Tor Nightfire. In this one, we follow a woman who goes off to an island where every 7 years, 7 people have to die, and otherwise the status quo continues. I was intrigued by this book, especially because it was compared to a few very famous movies, but I think that's a bit of a spoiler, so I won't name them in this video. But my understanding is that this was supposed to be a book that involves kind of a small town secret scenario or folk horror where everyone within the community knows the secret of the town, and we as a reader are getting it revealed to us. However, because that premise that I just told you is on the back of the book, this book kind of lacked suspense because you knew what the thing was right from the beginning, and instead you're just watching it play out. And of course, with a book like this, I feel like it relies on our ability to connect and care for the characters and care for their well-being. And as you can tell from the way I'm talking about this book, I just didn't. I really didn't connect with this one. I felt that it was quite boring because it lacked suspense. And despite being very short, I just didn't enjoy it, honestly, and was pretty much let down. Next is Little Eve by Catriona Ward, which is yet another Tor Nightfire title, and in this one we follow a group of people living on this mysterious isolated island or isle, and within the story there is a murder that takes place and those that go to investigate what happens. And I will be totally upfront and say that myself and Catriona Ward just do not get along. I've read her previous 2 books out by this publisher. The first one being The House on Needless Street. I really did not get along with that book. And I also read Sundial, which I actually thought was all right, but a little bit disappointing. And this one just rubbed me the wrong way. Specifically just reminded me a lot of Needless Street, which I thought was a pretty needless book. I don't actually have a problem with her prose, but what I do struggle with is her storytelling. I feel like the stories that she tries to write just are not interesting to me. I don't care about the characters. I find the story just very obvious, and that is kind of telegraphed to the reader in a way that I find obnoxious. I like when a reader is kind of pulled into the story and you feel really smart as you start to piece things together. Instead, I feel like she makes it way too obvious while expecting it to be more hidden, and it just, I don't know, it just rubbed me the wrong way. So I think a lot of my disdain from this book comes from the fact that it reminded me a lot of Needless Street. Even though the plot is quite different, the storytelling just had a whiff of that, which just turned me off from the beginning. So I don't think I'll be going out of my way to review any more books from her, just because I don't think that we get along. I know that other people love her books, and I always want to be balanced in my reviews, but she is not for me. I do not like her work, and I just don't get the appeal. And now to talk about a book that I did enjoy, I want to talk about Camp Slaughter by Sergio Gomez. This is a sequel to a book I absolutely love, and that is Camp Slaughter. I talked about this book in a previous video. Essentially, this is a book that I describe as nightmare fuel, one of the scariest books I've read, especially the prologue. In this book, we follow a few different groups of people who go off to the woods where there is possibly a group of cannibals living, and of course the story gets grisly and gross from there, and I loved it a lot. So this is the book that I've previously read, and so the author sent me a copy of their newest release, which should be coming out, I believe today is the publication date, and that is Halloween Slaughter, and this is a follow-up to the book. I do think that it would work as a standalone, but because of my love of the first book, I do think it's worth going back and checking out this first. I will be honest that I don't always love slasher sequels when it comes to books. I've read them a few times and I just find them to be pretty mediocre, but this one worked really well. I still prefer book 1 if I had to rank them, but this is a very close second in terms of my enjoyment. I thought the characters were well done. I thought it was exciting. It managed to capture the feel of a slasher story without feeling really cliche or campy. I thought that it had some good scares. I would say the first book is scarier, but there were still moments in this one that definitely got me. There were some scenes where I was like, whoa, this author has not phoned it in. This is still fantastic. So really excited to get a chance to read this one. And this is the book I teased at the beginning of the video. Given the title, the fact that it is set around Halloween, basically we follow the same slasher that is coming back to take revenge. It's a perfect book to read around Halloween. So if you're looking to stick one more book on your TBR, this is my personal recommendation. It's a new release and I think it was a lot of fun. Now switching to more of a mystery, I want to talk about Lavender House by Rosen, and this is a book I received for review from the publisher, which I believe is Forge. And in the story we follow a police officer who's working in the 1950s. He is let go or discharged from his job when it is discovered that he is gay. He is exposed at a club, and from there he ends up getting a private job working to discover what happened to this deceased woman who was involved or running this great soap empire. And so he goes off to this estate to investigate and find out what happens, and the story goes from there. This book is compared to a lot of things like Knives Out, and so given that, I expected this book to be a little bit more action-packed. Instead, what it is much lighter, much funnier, which I think is some of the comparisons to some of the movies. But basically, this is like a really fun queer romp that is written around a mystery, but it's the kind of book where you don't really care about the mystery and it's more about the characters and their banter and just the story going from there. So this was much lighter in tone than I expected. It was just very different than the kind of mysteries I picked up. I liked it. I didn't entirely love it, which again is more a fact that it wasn't a super dark, grisly serial killer mystery, but I love the queer elements. I thought the main character was instantaneously likable. I liked him from the first scene, and I definitely think you'll be rooting for him while you read this book. So I do think if that sounds up your alley, this is one you may want to check out. Next is From Below by Darcy, and this is a horror book that follows a group of divers that are going to investigate a ship that went missing long ago, and so they're going to investigate the wreckage. And this is basically a really classic horror story that has an ocean theme to it, which is something I really enjoy. I am not a strong swimmer, and because of that, I find the ocean absolutely terrifying. This is also my first time completing a novel by Darcy Coates, and that's because while she's a very well-known female horror author, most of what she writes is haunted house stories, which I've recently discussed are not my favorite. And so this was a better jumping off point for me because I love ocean horror, and I will say it worked pretty well. It was tense and claustrophobic. I didn't find the characters to be particularly remarkable. As with the whole story, I felt that it was very predictable and tropey. I've read several horror stories set in the ocean before. Let me know if you'd like a whole video on the topic. And this one I could add to the list, but it's not my favorite. I found it a little bit underwhelming, which is definitely not making me more anxious to read more Darcy Coates, especially since she mostly writes haunted house stories. But if you do have a book by her that isn't a haunted house story that is not this one, I would love your recommendation down below. I'm willing to try her again, but I just don't think she's up my alley. And finally, I want to talk about The Hostage by A.R. Carter, and this is a brand new thriller release that follows a young teenage girl, I believe she's 15, who is kidnapped and held hostage by this group because she is part of this wealthy family, and so they want to get some money from her, and they promise that as long as she plays along and does what she's told and the money gets paid out, they will return her to her family. The story is told over a few different perspectives, one being the girl herself who's in the situation, and we also get the perspective of the local police. This is a story that I should have loved. If you're familiar with my taste and love of kidnapping and hostage stories, this one sounded right up my alley, but for several reasons it didn't work as well as I hoped. So first off, the main character feels really young. Because of her age, it made the book feel like she was part of a young adult novel because she was just so young and naive, and I found it very frustrating. The book is targeted for an adult audience, but it definitely reads young because of that. And you also have a really cartoony Russian villain, which I just didn't love. I felt like it was kind of a stereotype and they could have done something a little bit more nuanced. My main complaint is that most of the story is told from the perspective of the police officer, which you think would be fine because that should be the police officer that is handling the mystery and is trying to, you know, find the young woman. However, you actually have it where this mystery or this case is out of her jurisdiction because it is turned over to the authorities above her. So you have this police officer who isn't actually the main investigating body, and so we follow her through a lot of this story as she is dealing with other cases, her personal life. She gets into some romance, there's some queer romance on the side and all of that. And I just want to get back to the main story. Why are we following a police officer who isn't investigating the case? And yes, eventually she gets tied in, but it just felt like a really strange narrative choice, and overall I just found the book really dissatisfying. I feel like this is the kind of book that I'm going to forget I have read if I look back on Goodreads a few months later, so I can't recommend it. If you absolutely love hostage stories and can't get enough of them, maybe check it out, but go in with pretty low expectations. I thought it was mediocre at best. Alright, so we made it to the end of the video here. I'd love to hear of the books I checked out, which ones are you planning on reading? And I would love to hear, what are you reading this Halloween season? I should mention, as you probably are aware, that I always pre-film my videos about a week in advance, so really this is more capturing what I read in September. And if you notice from the theme of this video, my reading is going just okay this spooky season. I'm hoping it's going to turn around in October, and so I'd love to hear what spooky books are you reading, and maybe I'll add them to my TBR as a last minute addition. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a comment, even if it's just a Halloween pumpkin. And if you want to help me out more, or you want to keep subscribed, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you'll never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.